Hello, Bart.
Hello, good afternoon.
Hey, thank you for coming over to our office.
It's beautiful here and a professional setup.
Absolutely, that's what we aim for. So, Bart, you work for Immuta, and Immuta is specializing in data access controls for data platforms in a broad sense. And of course, we spoke before, and data access control is, of course, a challenge our customers are facing with more often than not. And so typically, when we deploy Snowflake projects, we are in the space of private data, very granular data, and sooner or later, GDPR pops up.
Right.
And we are looking for an answer. We have been looking for an answer. We have tried building things ourselves, but then Immuta is this big name that keeps on popping up all the time. Could you please explain a bit what you guys are aiming for? What sort of business problem you are solving?
Right, sure. So what we do or what we aim is to make sure that the right people have the right level of access in their data platforms. Mm-hmm. Like we all put more data into those warehouses, and people want to scale that, which is great. More people can use it, get benefit value out of it. But you also want to make sure that only the right people have that right access. So that's the main thing we focus on, by making sure that access control are set.
Yeah, and who's your audience then? I can assume it's not the typical developer who is going to look for services like Immuta offers?
It depends, but what we see often is that it's it's that developer that now needs to spend a lot of their daily job on table crans and managing that access, where actually they want to develop new projects. That's more valuable. Yeah. But it could also come from the business, where today they don't have access because there's an engineering team that takes too long, or it actually comes from a privacy office or a compliance team that sees that the growth on the platforms is growing, but it's out of control. They need to bring in more control. So it depends.
Yeah, and I can relate to that. So we are, of course, in the business of developing and evolving data platforms. And when we deal with private data sets, well, access control typically becomes a bottleneck. So our engineers are dealing with private data. We're not always sure if an engineer should be allowed to deal with private data in clear text. We're not always sure if the controls that we impose are always double checked and continuously checked by data protection officers. And we more or less have the feeling that if you want to try to build things yourself, it doesn't really scale. Even though Snowflake has these role-based access controls natively built in, they have data masking natively built in. Those capabilities are great, and when we are explaining them to data protection officers and security people, everybody agrees that the approach is the right approach. But nonetheless, from a process point of view, we often get stuck. Is that something that you try to address?
No, definitely. And to come back to what you just mentioned is when you develop it, you are data engineers, you have people that really, really understand Snowflake and can work with defining those pipelines, setting it up. But you're probably not GDPR experts. You know a lot about it because in your job you need it. But you're not that expert. Are you collaborating with those privacy teams, or how does it work?
We do, yeah. Typically, we have a data protection officer in place, and they come up with the rules. Ideally, they come up with the rules. Sometimes we come up with propositions, and then they have to approve or not. So there's always this person of authority, legal authority, who has to have a say over the things that we are developing. Right.
Yeah, and what we see is that typically developing that self works for your first project or your handful of projects. It's when you bring in the first data sets, you don't have too many data sets. So you can manage that by hand on the individual objects. But there are also not that many users. And we also saw that in the past, but also now today, when you bring in a new project, is you create a project or a product for a specific team, a department, which means that all the end users are within that team or within that project. It's a handful of people. So in that case, you don't really have to think about access controls because everybody is in the same team. So if you look at GDPR, you have rules to minimize access to data. Well, you already comply with that because only the finance team works with that data. If it's financial data, for example, you have a purpose because everybody's using it for the same purpose. It's for their reporting, for example. That's why you set up the project. But then if you want to scale and use that data across the different business units, you want to not only onboard your finance department, also your logistics department or HR department, that's where things are getting complex. because of you have more data, but also like more users.
Yeah, and because I also see a trend in being more explicit in defining governance in datasets. So data mesh is all the rage today, and decentralized data processing and building central capability teams, building decentralized data processing teams. Somehow somebody has to keep an overview over the whole thing.
Right. Yeah. And that's very complex. It's like overview on like large data set, but like also you don't know. Like if I'm in finance, like I barely understand like how many roles there are within my department. If I want to share my data set with somebody in HR, then I also need to understand the full like role hierarchy in that department. And that just doesn't work. Yeah. Plus you have to prove that what you have done is the right thing. Yeah. And like, can you explain your like privacy officer, like all the table grants that you have done and that you show that like you actually did the right thing, and that's where like overview is typically lost. Yeah, and there's this process and governance layer that is super important, that we're sometimes organizations, teams, projects lose control over that. Right. But there's also the technology component. And so we centralize on Snowflake. All of the workload is processed in Snowflake. Right. But the data typically is not originated from Snowflake. It's somewhere else. And during the transport, there are security concerns. During the temporary storage, there are security concerns. Right. And that's like an issue that comes up more and more. And people are getting a deeper understanding of how data is traveling from their own on-premise data center to cloud, to somewhere else, to somebody else's cloud. And they feel insecure. And sometimes we get very challenging questions on that. Yeah, and I think it's like also like on a bigger role. Like now you're just discussing from your own data center to your own cloud to your own project. But like if you look on a global scale, like regulations don't like what you're talking typically about is like the business regulation, like how to bring that data, like what the engineer is allowed to work with what data. But then if you bring in data on like a more global scale, which we see like large organizations go to today, where they don't have only data in Belgium or in Europe, but they also have data in like the US or in APAC, for example. Like, how do you like share that data in that case? Because then a lot more regulations come up. Like then GDPR by itself is not enough, but you have also like other local regulations. Like you have like the local regulations, like European ones. So that's getting more complex. And then there are even more things to think about. So like if we come back to like 2 questions back, is like if you start your first project, that easy, but then if you want to grow that, then like there's a lot more that you need to think about. Yeah, we are more often than not faced with privacy shield, standard contractual clauses, all of these things that have a say about transferring private data from European premises to American companies. Challenging. Right, and if like as companies mature, what we expect is that you have more data. Like you can bring in more data, you have the tools to do it, like more people can access it, you get more value out of it. But what we actually see is that there's a decline of like access to data, because like first you have the business rules, like, okay, I have finance data, I want to share some of it to another department, but not all of it, because I want to also keep it for myself. But then you have like regulations like GDPR or like local regulations that you have in your country or in like your industry. Like pharma has their specific regulations, like banking have their own regulations. And then if you mature even further, like you might have like contractual rules, like third-party agreements where like you might procure data from a third-party vendor or your end users have signed a contract that data can only be used for that purpose. And if you scale, like you need to think about all that. And then instead of like getting more access to more data, even though more data is there, you cannot use it. Yeah, I can totally relate to that. So more often than not, if we don't have a centralized governance control in place, sensitive projects tend to get stalled on cloud, because people know that private data is being processed on cloud. Certain use cases just require the use of private data at the transactional level. But those projects get stalled because people feel insecure about the data and access controls. And as long as these things are in the hands of developers, they're not totally sure that developers don't have a way to bypassing things and so on and so forth. And that's also where the value is, right? Like the most valuable data products or projects that you're doing is typically with like personal data involved, where you have to be extra careful. It's also the most exciting projects to work on, probably. Definitely. So there's a lot of focus, but not that much traction. And there are many approaches to do this. Sometimes you build it yourself. Sometimes, if you look at how you develop, you create these kind of mapping tables. You sort of try to negotiate a data access matrix with your DPO, your cybersecurity person. But
in a homeroom situation, it's like always diverging in a very, very detailed, non-scalable way.
Right.
I assume these days people like you and your organization are very much focused on how to approach this thing in the right way so that it can be scaled across these larger types of use cases.
No, like you speak with like as many organizations, like if not more than we do. Mm-hmm. And what we see is that companies take different approaches, and one way to make it very secure and to get maximum control is to like take everything centralized, mm-hmm. And have like a central IT team owning everything, mm-hmm. Where some other companies are starting to talk data mesh or mm-hmm. like federated approaches. Like, how do you see that in the market? Like, is that shifting, or like, is there also still like a central team that creates their own governance processes and everybody need to adhere with like that very strict?
So data ownership is decentralized these days. So right. it's more often than not tied to ownership of source systems. Somehow we need to integrate source systems in larger data platforms, create combinations of those data sets, and then distribute them again to other users internally. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of this, like, sometimes it's really like a spaghetti-like maze right. of creating data sets, granting access to data sets, having them consumed on some other place, again, adding sometimes sensitive data to it, adding new types of data access controls to it, and then distributing it again. Right. It's definitely in larger organizations. And from experience, it just doesn't scale. And so without a centrally imposed, commonly agreed upon framework to arrange access controls right. on data in a data platform, it's an unmanageable spaghetti.
Yeah, and what we believe is that like it could be both. Like there is a part where you need to centralize things. Yeah. Like for example, GDPR, like every team needs to adhere with that. Like if you are in the pharma space, you have like your pharma specific rules, like that's everybody. You might also have like as a company, like your core values, like as a company, how do I want to treat personal data? And like maybe you do more than like what just the regulation says, like that can be central. But you also want to give like data owners the opportunity to be able to share their data with other teams. And that's something that you might not want to do centrally. Like maybe you want, but maybe not. And then it's like, how can you make that combination of like having central teams being able to set like 80% of the rules maybe, or 50, or like depends on the organization. Yeah. Where like the last bit can still be managed by the different data owners who might not be a SQL expert or not experts on like the Snowflake access controls.
Yes.
But like, how can they make sure that like that other team can use that data?
Yeah. Specifically, how would you approach that? And then I'm thinking specifically about cases like the right to know and the right to forget, the right to access certain kinds of data. We typically like to think in terms of roles or permissions that consumers sometimes give to companies to process certain types of data for certain types of use cases. What's your best practice?
So, like typically people like organizations are using like role-based access. So you create predefined groups of people and you give them access to predefined data. Like you can give like people that are in the finance team and are data scientists access to like this like list of 10 tables, and they can see all the data. Where maybe if you are in HR, you can see the same 10 tables, but like that like financial data or like the specific amounts need to be masked because that's not relevant for that persona. And then if you like look across like organizations, like that's many roles that you need to create, maintain, and you have to do it on every single data set. So that's why we say like if you like take an attribute-based approach, like attribute-based access control, then you have a model that can scale better. And it might be good to explain like briefly what like attribute-based access control is, because like attribute can mean various things. And we have attributes on the user side and attributes on the data. And if you look at like attributes on the user, like the first thing we and customers look at is using AD groups. Like that's a big part of like having an attribute on the user.
AD being Active Directory, the central repository of everybody who's working for an organization.
The main source of live roles today, probably. But then like as companies mature, like then you can also take, for example, HR data and like what's your role, like your job, your job title, in what location are you, or you can take e-learning data. Like, have you done your GDPR training? Or in pharma, we see it quite a bit where you need to have like specific training to access specific data or like levels of privacy. So that could be an attribute on a user. And like you can have that training, I have not, maybe. But that doesn't mean we have to create individual roles for every combinations of attributes. The example with countries is simpler. Like if you can see data from like Belgium and France, and I can see data from the Netherlands and Germany, like that's 2 roles. But then there's somebody that sees Germany and France and the Netherlands, and like that's that skill. Where with Immuta, like you could say, like, or with attribute-based access control, you say, I have the attribute to see like this list of countries. Like that's on the user side. But then like you need to map that to the data, and that's where you have attributes on the data side, where we can leverage, for example, tags on data to say like, okay, where do we have PII data? Where do we have data that belongs to the finance domain, to the customer domain, to whatever domain? And those 2 are linked. So like every data set where we have PII data, I want to mask that PII data, except, and then you can say like if somebody has done the training. And then you can take a central approach where like you can create those policies, those rules, independent of the data and independent of the users and their groups. But you just define the rule, and then that will scale across your hundreds, not thousands data sets, but also thousands of users.
So let me try to rephrase it in my own words. What you just said, because I really think it's interesting because it taps in both technology as well as in process and governance.
Absolutely.
So if you talk about learning management systems, if you talk about Active Directory, actually you're talking about a process that is already in place in an organization with certain controls, with certain policies, to assign a certain kind of sticker to a person. You don't need to redesign those processes. They are already in place, they're being tested, they're being approved, and they've been audited already. And if I understand it well, the proposal you make here is to use that sort of sticker-based approach, tag-based approach, to grant access to data that by itself is also classified. Maybe not so much classified by a process already. Maybe it can be classified by a data catalog. Maybe it can be classified by a data protection officer. Maybe it can be auto-classified. And we've seen those cases where, based on certain occurrences of certain patterns, data can be auto-classified as, for example, social security.
We have sensitive data discovery, where we can automatically find sensitive data within your data sets, for example.
Okay. So if we look at your project specifically, or product specifically, you merge those 2 worlds. You tap into the world from audited processes. You pull that data in. You offer a capability to tag certain data sets, and you offer the capability to put rules on those combinations of who a person is and what a data set contains.
So you really decouple it. So instead of like defining your rules in Snowflake, your table grants and your row access policies, conditional masking, so you decouple that from the individual tables, individual columns to like an attribute, a tag. And that means that everywhere where like that pattern is found, we're gonna apply that rule. Which means that like you can have like one policy that can span like all those data sets. And also on the user side, like you don't have to print individual stickers for everybody, but like that sticker is generated based on like your trainings, your position. And you don't have to. So like an example is like you can create a role that's finance data science, like that's one role, and then you need to create another like HR data science. Or you can say like I'm in the finance department and I am a data scientist. And that really drastically reduces the number of roles to create. And that's how you can keep that overview. Like companies, I don't know, like you probably know better, but like you can have like thousands of like roles in a data.
Sure thing. Try to keep an overview on that.
Where like a typical customer of us, they have like 20, maybe 50 policies to spend like those thousands of tables.
And who creates those policies? Well, there's the design of the policy and the technical creation of the policy. Is it the same person? Is it different roles? Who does this?
Right, like we just discussed like that model where, for example, like a central team, they can put in the main rules, and then the different data owners, they can set their specific sharing of data to other teams, for example, or they want to mask specific columns for that individual table. And then it could be an IT department that set those policies, but it could also be like the privacy office, like the ones that really understand GDPR. They really understand like compliance, but they're not an expert on like Snowflake.
Yeah, of course.
They can set the policies and leverage those attributes. And then it's Immuta in our case that actually pushes that to Snowflake, and then we use those principles still. So we manage the table grants and we manage the conditional masking, row access, etc.
Okay.
But by using the plain English language that like a legal person would write in the platform.
So again, here we're at a somewhat interesting conjunction, I think, because you are actually decoupling the design and the implementation of an access control from the design and the development of a data transformation process. And so like the challenge we face is if our developers come in and we start loading data using the principles that we have, it's still developers who get the first touch point with private data. And it's developers who get to assign development roles. And if you look at it from a, say, GDPR point of view, developers are no people who should be able to see private data for processing, right?
That's one way, and like you cannot expect from developers to know everything about like how to set up those policies. Like who should I grant that access? And based on what? Like maybe we want to have that purpose as a condition to give you that access. You cannot pre-pack that in a bunch of roles.
Yeah, indeed. Honestly, we are an engineering firm. We have a very quiet office today, but typically there is multiple teams here behind us who are sometimes partly creating that sort of logic. Because we're focused on Snowflake. When a company, a large organization, procures Snowflake, they agree with the terms and conditions of Snowflake. There's a capability called data masking built inside. Data masking passed already security controls, audit and compliance. Data masking is often an approved feature to use within development processes. And if it's smaller scale projects, I'm going to be very open. We can build that ourselves. And maybe sometimes accept a bit of residual risk. How do you look at it? Because I know there's a tipping point. As of a certain tipping point, it's just way too much maintenance. It shouldn't be our colleagues who configure the framework that we built to work. It shouldn't be our execution engine who deploys the rules. It shouldn't be our approval process. How do you see a tipping point? Because we're not going to be the only ones, of course.
No, I completely agree. Like if you have like a handful of tables or like one project, like you don't need a platform. Like build it yourself. Like that will work. But it's that like where you need that scale where you really need to think about like, okay, how is this like going to grow and how can we maintain this over time? And what we see is like if you do data access well, there are three basically stages or pillars that you need to comply with. Like first is you need to discover. You need to understand like what data do we have actually. Start with that.
That's a big task already, huh?
And that's complex.
It's complex.
Like where do we have finance data? Where do we have like HR data? Where do we have R&D data? But then also like where do we have PII? Like where do you have sensitive data? And that's the first step. Like do we actually know what data we have? And this is typically where, for example, like data catalogs come in. And we can do it as well, but we're also happy to partner with those data catalogs to bring in that data. Like again, like we like to use data that's already in your Active Directory or in your e-learning systems. We also like to use data that's already in your data catalog. And then once you have discovered that, like that's very valuable information. Like you know users and their groups and their like, trainings, etc. You know the data and like the tags, classifications. So let's use that to protect it. And then that's the second pillar where it's really about like making sure that you can lock down the data where you need to, but also open it up where you don't have to. Like let's make sure that that data is actually being used across the organization. But then like even though that's all done, you need to prove that the thing is right. And what you mentioned is like typically like you have signed the contract with Snowflake, like the table grants and conditional like that's approved features. You might have like an architecture board that says like this is the best practice to use. But then if you need to show that like actually like what you have said is the right thing and that like not people that shouldn't see the data can see the data, like that's actually pretty hard. Like if you want to show like this is the full list of users that can see this individual table and this is how they can see it, like that's a task if you need to audit that.
Sure thing. Yeah.
And we haven't seen that many external regulators checking for GDPR, but we see them more and more.
Yeah.
And like that will be a big task that like you cannot spend on like creating new projects. And so that third piece is to monitor. Like, can you prove that what you've done is the right thing?
Indeed.
And show?
Yeah.
And like those three things, like if you want to build that yourself, like that's a new product that you're creating. Where like you want to work on your pharma use case or your finance use case. Like you're a bank or you're a pharmaceutical or you're a, like you name it, whatever branch you are. Like you're not a software creator.
Indeed,
that focus fully on access control.
Yeah, you hit a few nails, of course, there, because using the feature and the capability in Snowflake to do some data masking or to do some row-based data access, it's out there. It's a matter of configuration. Engineers can do it, but it's not about that feature, of course. It's about the whole compliance framework around it.
Yeah, how do you leverage that feature, and can you show that you're using it right?
Yeah,
absolutely.
Indeed. Yeah. Immuta, how do you guys actually deploy? Are you guys a SaaS? I'll just give a bit of a background on the question. Procuring software for larger organizations, especially when software is dealing with private data, is often challenging. And people are very much aware of these data transfer agreements between the EU and the US. And software startups, software companies, typically US-based, people are sometimes a bit nervous about who's going to see the data, and can a software company be forced to hand over private data to a governmental agency? Do you guys deploy yourself? Can you deploy on-prem? Do you deploy on your own VPC? Are you guys a SaaS? What is your deployment process in the points?
It's a very valid question.
Yeah.
And we get it a lot because like people that talk to us are people that like have a lot of data that scale, but they're sensitive data, so they need a solution. So then like access control in the cloud is also like a concern.
You should get that question. It's like critical before you can start rolling out a process like that.
I would say it's almost a daily asked question.
Yeah.
We prefer to deploy a SaaS. That's the model that we see used the most.
Yeah.
And then like we host the solution. So it's in our own networks, but we connect to like your data platform, like whether that be Snowflake in this case or your Databricks, Redshift, like BigQuery, like the other technologies that we integrate with. And what we do is we use like the native controls within those platforms. So instead of like pulling the data to our system and like we look at the data and we process it, we just tell Snowflake what to do. So we manage table grants, we manage the connection.
Does it mean, sorry to interrupt, does it mean you're not a data processor then as such? You're just pushing commands to Snowflake, who's typically already approved as a data processor to process data on their end. Okay,
And of course, you still need to prove that, and like, well, we have the legal wordings for that.
Yeah.
But that's where like we typically push it towards like the different platforms. And Snowflake, like that's where your data lives, that's where it stays. And we just tell Snowflake what to do. But still, if you look at, for example, like audit logs, that can still be considered as sensitive because, well, there might be sensitive information there. So that's why we say, okay, well, we can deploy within the regions where the regulations apply. So we can deploy in the US, but we can also deploy within Europe or in APAC to make sure that like if you use like Europe, that data doesn't leave Europe.
And you're tied to specific clouds, or are you like cloud agnostic?
Well, since we don't have to process that data, we are fairly cloud agnostic.
Yeah.
We just tell Snowflake wherever that is what to do with it, and we are in Europe, and so that's how you can prove that we are like not getting the data towards the US, for example.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. So, what does it take to start a project? Assume Snowflake is in there, the platform is in there, the governance controls are built, we can scale, teams are set up, pilot projects have run, people are in the starting blocks. Yeah. And now comes private data.
Right.
Okay, bells start to ring. Something needs to happen. How does a project look like?
No, it's a very good, like one like quick example I wanted to give there is one of the pharmaceuticals that we see here in Europe, where like they've done the proof of concepts, like they did all the tests, they were ready to go. But at that moment, Snowflake introduced their conditional masking, row level access, and their like native features. So then they asked us like, why do we have to like use Immuta? Why not build it ourselves? And that's what they did. So a bit disappointing for us, of course, but fair play, like go for it. And then 6 months later, they realized like, okay, this doesn't scale. Like we can do it for a handful of tables, we can do it for our data sets. But if we want to provide like a capability across the org, that will be very tough. So that's when we came back. And that's where we start our implementation together with the customer to come up with like, okay, like what are best practices and how can we come up with something that like will work for today, but also scales towards the future. And that's really looking at like, okay, like what data do you have? Like who should have access? And can we translate your like role-based table grants into an attribute-based policy that will scale? But you're not on your own there, of course. Like we're happy to help or involve our partners that like are experts on that to do that.
Yeah. In terms of turnaround time, are we talking about days, weeks, months, maybe years? Any ballpark numbers?
Well, I don't have to explain you that very depends on like the industry where you are and like do you have all those approvals and those checks to get started? But like from our perspective, like we can be up and running in like a handful of days because of SaaS and like it's just like connection to Snowflake. But to really think about, okay, like what policies do we need to set up? Like where do we get those attributes from? Do we want to integrate it with our e-learning platform, for example? That's where like, well, you need to make a plan. So